Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Democracy Exchange with the DePo, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding. I'm your host, Samantha Conrad. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a restful holiday break. I'm so happy to be back in the host seat, and we're so ready to bring you more episodes of Democracy Exchange here in 2025. Jumping back into content, today's episode is going to be about a topic that becomes more and more important with each passing day, and that topic is climate change. And today, to talk about climate change with us, is our expert guest, Dr. Kear. Dr. Kear happens to be both an expert on the environment and sustainability, as well as public policy and the American government. And before we jump in, to explain very briefly, climate change is best described as long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns, and we know, obviously, that human activity, such as burning of fossil fuels, is the main cause of climate change. And now I'm going to turn it over to our host, or to our guest, Dr. Kear. Dr. Kear, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. So my first question is, I know that climate change scientists have been saying for years that there needs to be significant action by the state and local governments to combat climate change. And why are they saying this? Like, what is the basis? Why are climate change scientists so strongly urging climate action?
That's a good question. And I'm glad that you led with the definition of what climate change is, because oftentimes people conflate global warming with climate change and confuse just short-term weather patterns with long-term weather patterns and precipitation and all of that. There's a variety of reasons why climate scientists are urging action at the state and local level, as well as like national and international level. With the temperatures rising globally, right? With more of the sun's radiation getting trapped in the atmosphere, we have melting of glaciers. We have the warming of the oceans. We have, lots of carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere, and that's being absorbed by the oceans as well. What are the effects? What are the impacts, right? And we'll probably get to those in subsequent questions, but just the rising temperatures of our oceans are causing coral bleaching, and that's where a majority of ocean life is. That and the pH levels of the water as well. So you've got that. If we do have glaciers melting, say like in Greenland, if Greenland's glaciers were all to melt, sea levels would rise by 7 meters, like 23 feet. So if you look globally where people live, we have, massive amounts of population centers and cities in coastal areas. So we could have flooding. So you could kiss Florida goodbye, right? Then you have kind of the, exacerbation of, intense weather events like hurricanes, right? Hurricanes are stronger, when they hit the Gulf of Mexico because the surface temperatures of the Gulf of Mexico, a couple degrees in surface temperature raise can turn a Category 3 hurricane into a Category 5 hurricane. Those are just some of the things, dealing with sea, but also we've got, issues on land and, changing weather patterns on land, increasing drought, which also affects our food supply and our agriculture industry globally. So you have that as well. So, the list just goes on and on. I could probably go on for an hour just on that alone. But those are just some of the things that, climate scientists are saying, hey, we need to deal with this at the state and local level, and actually at all levels, from the individual all the way up to the international.
I'm really glad you brought up the Florida hurricanes, especially because one of the things that prompted me to do this episode was the California wildfires that have obviously been ravaging California for the past few weeks. And my question to you is, what part does climate change play in the California wildfires or like other devastating natural disasters that we've been seeing?
Yeah, climate change doesn't necessarily increase the number of hurricanes. It just adds to the intensity of hurricanes. And so, just a couple degrees, temperature change in the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, like I said before, can make a Category 3 hurricane into a Category 5 hurricane. What's going on in California presently? Well, like many problems, there are lots of causes, right? Climate change is just one variable in why the wildfires have been so devastating in the Los Angeles area. that area of the country, right? They have these Santa Ana winds. And, in the fall of past year, California was in the midst of a drought. And so they didn't get the precipitation that they normally would get. You couple that with, almost hurricane force winds from the Santa Anas, you get a drought, which means a lot of the underbrush was basically just tinder waiting to go and waiting to start a fire. And you also have, kind of the development of, the suburban areas into the exurban areas, right? Into the wildland areas. And we haven't done a good job at fireproofing our homes. I mean, many of the homes, in Los Angeles, and, just look at, the varying areas that have been on fire are old, right? Passed down generation after generation. And we haven't done a good job of fireproofing those homes. We haven't done a good job of, having barriers between kind of the wildlands and the suburban areas. You couple that with, pretty intense, suburbanization, right? So lots of homes. And, so you have a combination of urban planning, not preparing adequately for potential fires, and then you have climate throwing the drought in there and these hurricane force winds, and one little spark can create what we've seen, which is an absolute catastrophe. I think they're estimating that it's about $30 billion in damage, and some of those communities will never recover. And it's what 25 or 6 people have died in this, which is a minor miracle. I mean, it's great that that number is so small, but it's still consequential, right? Still 25 people died from this catastrophe. And, not to mention, forget about insurance, right? Insurance companies are dropping policies from Florida to California for homeowners. So a number of those homeowners had their policies dropped recently. And so the insurance industry certainly believes in climate change, and it's costing them a fortune. And so they're trying to minimize their risk. So once the insurance companies minimize their risk, where do homeowners get insurance from? Like the state of Florida, the state of California. Can they afford $30 billion, the state of California, to pay for this? No. So climate change, coupled with how we've, say, maybe mismanaged our development and not prepared and not done the adequate mitigation and adaptation to deal with wildfires or to deal with hurricanes, is really kind of a recipe for disaster. So I would say that we really in the future need to look towards how do we mitigate the damage? How do we adapt? How do we know that there are going to be wildfires, so how can we fireproof? Where do we build? Should we build in certain areas or should we not? So we need to start thinking about those things for the future.
Despite obvious signs of climate change related turmoil in the United States, why do you think that there are so many citizens in the United States that won't acknowledge the urgent need for climate action?
Well, that's another good question. There's been a concerted effort by the oil and gas industry through time to deny that, the burning of fossil fuels actually contributes to global warming, which contributes to climate change. Through a number of lawsuits, we've found out that, ExxonMobil back in the 1960s and 1970s, they actually did some climate modeling based upon our fossil fuel consumption. And they realized back then that, yes, this is going to increase temperatures globally. And, the addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, as well as methane, another greenhouse gas, which is the primary compound in natural gas, was going to drive temperatures up. And so I think, and it kind of like the big tobacco industry back in the day, they knew that cigarette smoking caused cancer, but yet they denied it. And, they had campaigns to kind of obfuscate and cover it up. And so we still have that today with the fossil fuel industry doing the same thing. Now they might try to do some greenwashing and say, hey, we're doing some really good things to, to do environmentally friendly drilling and such. But at the end of the day, they've known for a long time. So I think it's that misinformation campaign in part that, is kind of driving citizens to not believe in climate change. I would say another thing is that, with the intense polarization of, those on the left and those on the right, and kind of the politicization of climate, right? That also I think is a wedge, for driving people to say, I really question this. There's also a growing, I think, push questioning science and the scientific method in general, right? If you're looking at the climate science and the climate scientists from a variety of different disciplines, right? It's nearly unanimous that our combustion, our burning of fossil fuels is driving climate change. It's not even close. And so there has been a questioning of that science. But the science is settled. Now the politics is not, right? And so there is political contestation and legitimate political contestation on what should we do. Denying that the problem exists is something that people who don't want an issue to get on the agenda often do. Just deny that it's not real, that it doesn't exist. Unfortunately, we're not beyond that point. And so, we have leaders that are pushing those narratives as well. And I think we need to move beyond that and have a more, sane, rational, friendly conversation. And part of it is those on the left who are kind of preachy about climate change and looking down on others who don't believe in it. And that's really no way to have a conversation. To think that you know more than somebody about a particular issue, that's not a way to engage. And so we need to find better venues to engage each other and better ways to engage each other about this issue. You just look back when we passed all of our major environmental laws in the United States back in the 1970s and 80s. When the Clean Air Act was passed, it was nearly unanimous vote in the Senate to pass the Clean Air Act. Same thing for the Clean Water Act. So historically, we did have kind of a commonality between Democrats and Republicans on the environment. It wasn't until, the Reagan era of the 1980s and then the 1990s that there was that divergence between Democrats and Republicans with respect to the environment and in particular climate. So lots of things, I think, to answer that question, lots of things are making people question whether it's real or not. But certainly more people are experiencing the negative effects and impacts of climate change. When you have floods in Asheville, North Carolina from a hurricane, a couple hundred miles inland, people are, I think, now realizing, well, I don't have to live in Louisiana or Florida to be negatively impacted by climate change. So I think through maybe a more constructive dialogue, more people will start to understand. And if you're experiencing something negatively directly, more people are going to begin to understand how dire the circumstance is.
On that note, on the note about government action, I feel the sentiment from everyone that believes in climate change and wants climate action is that there seems to be a frustrating lack of action from the federal government and state governments from both political parties. Why do you think that climate change is such a low priority, seemingly, on their priority list?
That's a great question. Certainly your generation, it's a front and center issue, right? And, and just look at who's in power, right? Look at what generation is in power in the U.S. Congress right now and what they look like. And you could probably say that at the state level as well. So I think maybe it's a generational thing. Younger generations have other problems that they feel are more pressing than older generations. The inaction of our federal government has been a pretty long time. We've been inactive at the federal level dealing with climate. the United States used to be a global leader with respect to environmental issues. The 1970s, 1980s laws that I was talking about, other countries around the world copied those. But subsequently, we've kind of been a laggard. We've lagged behind other countries, especially at the federal level, in addressing climate. I would say that the Inflation Reduction Act, right, of 2022, is the most significant federal action that the United States has ever undertaken with respect to climate change. I mean, to the tune of $500 billion, right? Throwing subsidies, loans, tax breaks, pushing energy efficiency, pushing the electrification of our transportation system, investing in, battery plants, investing in electric vehicle plants domestically, providing subsidies for the common person for, doing energy efficiency in one's home, putting more insulation in, maybe putting solar panels on the roof. So there has been some action. Now, it remains to be seen how that act will be implemented under the new administration, right? But it's still law. Under the Obama administration, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the federal government put about $100 billion towards renewable energy, kind of in if you will, a green new economy, right? That also kind of gets some bad press, a green new economy. But, and I would say too that there are over 30 states that have renewable portfolio standards. And a renewable portfolio standard is simply the state requires the major utilities to get a certain percentage of their energy from renewables by a certain date. So Ohio even has a renewable portfolio standard, which a few years ago our state legislature actually reduced that number from like 12.5% to 8% or 7.5%. But there are states like Hawaii that have really aggressive renewable portfolio standards, and they want to get 100% of their energy from renewables by, say, 2040 or 50 or something like that. So there has been action, but because it's such a large problem and it's an expensive problem to deal with. So I think that's part of the reason why there has been inaction, because state and local governments have to balance their budgets. Now, the federal government doesn't, right? And so the federal government really is the source for funding to help address this. So there has been action, but maybe not as much as some folks like you maybe would like, and myself, right?
On that note as well, I saw recently that the U.S. Climate Vulnerability Index, and on there it shows that there are some states, obviously, that are substantially more vulnerable to climate change than others, and some states obviously are much less vulnerable or are doing much better in terms of climate change. And what do you think explains like this severe contrast that we see in the United States?
Now, that's a good question. I think geography has something to do with it. Where states are located geographically. We don't have to worry about hurricanes in Ohio, right? But we do have to worry about drought and floods. And so geography plays a great deal with it. I was when you gave me those list of questions, I was trying to think like, okay, well, what else? Maybe the political culture and maybe the state legislatures in particular states are more apt to, one, acknowledge that climate change is real, and two, to actually put legislation forth to address that. I think it was around 2000 or so that California, unsurprisingly, right, but it was Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time, they passed the first state-level climate law, right? And so, I wouldn't say red state, blue state difference, but there is a red state, blue state difference, depending on who's controlling the state legislature and the governor's office in how or if they will actually address, right, the issue at hand. So geography, political culture, And I would also say that, where states get their revenues from is an important factor. I did my doctoral research on natural gas politics in the American West, looking at Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Well, Wyoming gets a majority of its revenues from natural resource extraction, from coal, from gas, from mineral extraction. And so Wyoming historically has been a pro-natural resource development state, and not a let's pass a climate law state, right? So it kind of augurs against their own revenue self-best interest to address climate change. So kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but geography, politics, they all play into whether a state decides to address it or not.
And kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier, it's hard to ignore the prevalence of certain interest groups in climate action or inaction taken by governments. Why would certain groups benefit from the government's inaction, and what would those groups want from the government?
Well, you could probably answer this question really well. So one of the major industry representative groups is the American Petroleum Institute. So how would the American Petroleum Institute benefit from inaction on climate change? Well, they represent the oil and gas industry. And by passing laws that would undermine our use of oil and gas would fundamentally affect their bottom line, right? The oil and gas industry does have a point. I mean, we rely on fossil fuels for pretty much everything. I mean, if you just look around this room, the plastics in here, fossil fuels. How did we get here today? Well, I drove, right? And so our economy is so based on fossil fuels that switching away immediately would be somewhat catastrophic to the everyday person. And so I understand the argument on that side, but you just look at the level of money in politics these days. We just had a Senate race here in Ohio that almost $500 million was spent electing a senator. That's obscene, right? But the oil and gas industry, because we have allowed our politics, our Supreme Court has allowed through Citizens United, basically the Citizens United case a while ago, allowing political action committees, not affiliated with the candidates, to spend unlimited amounts of money and get that unlimited amount of money from the wealthy, the American Petroleum Institute. And so, that whole kind of funding, by interest groups. And as a political scientist, I'm going back all the way to the days of, the Federalist Papers and James Madison. And Madison said, we need to worry about interest groups. He called them factions. And Madison's solution was, well, maybe the factions will compete against each other and they'll just cancel each other out, or the best faction will win. Well, right now it's the most moneyed faction that's winning, right? The Sierra Club will never, ever have the resources that the American Petroleum Institute has. So if you're just talking about money and politics, there's an imbalanced playing field that's playing out in our politics. So, and another thing I would say about American politics is that the hardest thing to do is to change the status quo. And in the research that I've done on natural gas politics and oil politics at the state level and the federal level, all of our early laws were designed to promote the development of the resource. So when it was back when President George W. Bush was president, and his vice president Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton, which is an oil and gas industry company, they said drill baby drill, right? And President Trump now is saying drill baby drill. Well, we've been doing that since the inception of drilling, and all of our laws are geared towards drilling and towards extracting the resource, not wasting the resource. At the federal level, the laws are geared towards getting revenues and controlling the resource. At the state level, we kind of get more into the nuts and bolts of what's the drilling look like? What's the permitting? How much space do we put between wells, and things like that. But you know, kind of going back to your original question, like interest groups benefit greatly from maintaining the status quo. And one of the hardest things to do in American politics is change that status quo. So, you know, and I think we're up against a wall. Those interest groups that are trying to change the status quo aren't as moneyed. They don't have the money to influence public opinion. They don't have the money to give towards political action committees to get certain people elected who, you know, benefit greatly from that as well. And I would add that, you know, the present administration's, you know, the Trump administration's push to drill more, the United States is already the global leader in natural gas production and oil production. And this happened under Democrat watch as well as Republican watch, right? So under the Biden administration, we produced more oil and gas than we ever have in the United States. I don't really think we can drill that much more, right? And, you know, per capita, the United States, we're the global leader in carbon dioxide emissions. Now, China's the global leader in total emissions, but per person, we are. So we would have to change our lifestyles and do a lot of different things. But I think the interest groups and the interest group hold on our politics, maybe the stranglehold on affecting change, is significant. And, you know, other than like changing electoral laws, right, trying to get money out of elections, that would be a good first step. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And how do you think the results of the 2024 election and the Trump administration, what effect do you think those will have on future climate change policies in America?
Oh, we see it already. I mean, you see it through the slew of executive orders that President Trump has signed. Our withdrawal again from the Paris Climate Accords, which, by the way, most countries aren't meeting their projected reductions as they said they were going to. So one, you have kind of a withdrawal from our presence on the international stage dealing with climate. You know, you have the push to drill more, to increase permitting, to have more leasing on federal lands. So those are just a couple. Also, I think President Trump said something about getting rid of the $7,500, $8,500 rebate that you would get from purchasing an electric vehicle. Now, you're a political scientist, right? So executive orders, like all presidents sign them, right? It's basically an order that the president gives the bureaucracy that has the force and rule of law, but it doesn't have to be okayed by the Senate. Well, the president is also tasked with upholding and enforcing the Constitution and the law, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And it is the president's job to implement that law. So, you know, I question whether just by an executive order, you know, the president can overturn, you know, established law and statute. So I think we'll see whether that $7,500, $8,500 tax rebate goes away or not. And I surmise that, and it's already happening, that a lot of this kind of anti-climate change policy is going to go to the courts. And so eventually the courts are going to arbitrate on, you know, whether those executive orders are constitutional or not. You know, can the president do that? The president does have, you know, leeway in how he or she maybe eventually, you know, implements that law. But so it's having a direct impact immediately. I would say, however, that a great deal of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act is going towards areas that are Republican, you know, right-leaning areas. So, you know, battery factories in Tennessee and electric vehicle factories in Arkansas or Alabama. And so I would think that there would probably be some pushback from, you know, red state Republicans and their districts who are benefiting greatly, right, from the Inflation Reduction Act and from the money that's being injected into their communities. So, that may have been intentional when they designed that act to kind of put money into the middle class and into our industrial base, which, by the way, has been hollowed out. And so, I think it really is at the end of the day, it really is a bipartisan bill that's going to help people in rural areas, economically, but, indirectly through climate as well. So we shall see, right? In the environmental policy literature, they rate presidents based on kind of their environmental records. And, first time around, Trump didn't rate very high. And so I would probably say that you can expect more of that.
And to start on a more positive note,
yes,
what do you think that state governments could do to promote climate action and combat climate change and promote sustainability?
Wow. What could they do? There are a number of things. I mean, Ohio, for example, we could bolster our renewable portfolio standard. Ohio as a state could pass more stringent energy efficiency regulations and laws, right? So pass the law and then, the low-hanging fruit really for individuals dealing with climate change, you can't talk about climate change without talking about energy, right? Because how we consume and use energy is a driver of climate change. And so anything that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, right? Renewable portfolio standards are a great way of doing that. The electrification of our transportation system, great way of doing that. Globally, like 92% of all transportation is fueled by fossil fuels. So, and that's a major contributor. So we need to think about that. At the state level and at the federal level as well, we're mothballing, we're taking out of production and use coal-burning power plants, but they're being replaced by natural gas plants, right? So you're still going from one fossil fuel to another. What else could the states do? Have education campaigns about it. States could pass legislation that deals with climate change adaptation and mitigation. Not passing legislation that, forbids the education of climate change in K through 12 or universities, right? So that is something they could do. They could incentivize green consumerism, right? But green consumerism, for those people who want to do something about it individually, is a good way to go, but generally green products are a little bit more expensive. Similarly, if you look at the average cost of an electric vehicle in the U.S., it's about $43,000. That's out of the price range for most of us, right? And so how can we, incentivize the auto industry? The federal government's trying through the Inflation Reduction Act to do that. States don't necessarily have the money to kind of help with that, but so the states could, we have utility monopolies, and if we could bust up the monopolies and encourage the utilities to, build and invest in greener infrastructure. So that's something that we could do at the state level. Passing climate action laws is something we could do at the state level. But that takes political will. And unfortunately, it's a very partisan issue. So it depends on who controls the governor's office and who controls the legislature to do that. But there are a number of things that states can do, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need federal, input in the United States about this.
And our final question for today, what can we as individuals do to promote climate change awareness or make an impact in our communities?
So there are a number of things that you can do. Think about your lifestyle. And, there are a number of things that we could change in our lifestyle. Are you close enough when you go to the grocery store that you could ride your bike or walk? Maybe, maybe not, right? It depends on how much grocery shopping you're doing, right? So being conscious of how we move ourselves, right? Is there public transportation available? Well, unfortunately, in Northwest Ohio, there's not, right? Not enough, right? There are dietary things that we could do. I'm not saying everyone needs to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but, a heavy meat lifestyle, right, that many Americans live is also a heavy carbon footprint lifestyle. And not to mention the health effects of eating too much meat, right? So we could do that also, when if we're talking about how we live and what we buy, the products that we buy. So there's the kind of green consumerism, the lifestyle things, and there are more than what I just said, but those are just a few examples of what you can do at an individual level. You can join an organization. There are lots of non-governmental organizations out there, and that are promoting action to deal with climate change. The organization 350.org. Well, why is it called 350? Well, 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That's what they say is a safe level in the atmosphere. Right now, I think we're at 420, 421, 422. So we've greatly exceeded that. So you could join an NGO, an environmental NGO. The traditional way, and as a political scientist, you could write your legislator, right? You could say, hey, Representative Latta, this is a issue that's really concerning to me. And, whether Latta does anything about that remains to be seen, but nonetheless, you could be engaged on that level. And you could be engaged not just, kind of our federal representation, but at the state level. Burrowing down even more locally, what can we do at the city level? Does the city of Bowling Green have a climate action plan? Bowling Green State University does, right? I'm working with a student right now doing an honors project on looking at, what we've done. How are we doing? And so getting involved, I think, at the local level, even at the university level or at the school level or, at the kind of city town level, and being involved and going to meetings. Like, okay, what do we have any climate policies in Perrysburg or in BG? And if we do, what are we doing? Are we pushing more bike lanes and, pushing public transportation? What are we doing? So, I think getting involved from the federal level all the way down to the local level, looking at our lifestyles, and just having conversations with not only your friends, but, you're on a, university campus. There are people that probably don't have the same beliefs that you do. And maybe just engaging in conversation with people who don't think like you, I think is a really good first step, starting that dialogue, right? Because, I think Republicans and Democrats and those on the left and right, we do have a lot in common. And like finding that common ground and treating each other with respect to have a sane, non-confrontational conversation about complex subjects like climate change, that's a necessary step. And so that's what I would encourage a lot of people to do, is kind of be more open-minded about that and try and have those difficult conversations.
Dr. Kear, thank you so much for being on our show today. Today was our last stop at Democracy Exchange with the DePo. I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Kear, once again. And thank you to the DePo social media and podcast team, Samantha Perry and Maria Litrieri. And special thanks to the Falcon Radio and Professor Robert Alexander, our founder. I've been your host and researcher, Samantha Conrad. Join us next time at Democracy Exchange with the DePo. To find the video version of this podcast, you can find us on our YouTube page at BGSU DePo and for the rest of our socials. Bye for now.